Hello, everybody. Happy Pride Week. My name is Nada Mergani, and I am the Programs Associate for Charlotte Pride. I'm really sorry that you're not seeing my face. I know that's so devastating, but my webcam just is having trouble. I still wanted to get through this presentation, though, so instead, you'll just be hearing my voice, in contrary to the last couple of days where you saw my face as we went through this PowerPoint as well. Um, It's a beautiful virtual Pride Week, and we still have events going on. Up until August 2nd, you can participate in the Pride sites, and you can also be involved in the citywide scavenger hunt. The URL for that is charlottepride.org/scavenger hunt. This is the third PowerPoint in our three-part series honoring the voices of our Latinx heroes. Yesterday, we honored the voices of lesbian leaders in our movement, and the day before that, we honored the voices of trans heroes in our movement, and the really powerful impact they made. The importance of this conversation revolves around the desire for us to have an understanding of our history that isn't inherently Eurocentric, that isn't inherently male-centric, that isn't inherently whitewashed, isn't inherently cis-centered, because our community is a very, very diverse one. And throughout essentially the entire history of the fighting for LGBTQ liberation, we've consistently seen Black and brown folks in the forefront of that fight, and trans and gender nonconforming folks in the front of that fight, and lesbian women in the front of that fight. And that's a lot of the reason why we chose to have this conversation today. We can move on to the next slide. By the way, if you hear me say like we can move to the next slide, Matt is helping with tech stuff and helping as well to moderate comments. So I'll be talking to Matt every now and then, just being like, please like move forward to the next slide. So before we can have this conversation, we should probably start with a conversation of what is Eurocentrism and Americentrism, also known as US centrism, and why is it harmful? So Eurocentrism represents a biased worldview where world history is skewed to inflate the influence of the Western world and the European world, as well as demonize the actions of the non-Western world by viewing the history of non-Western societies from a Western lens. So basically, to shorten the explanation of that, Eurocentrism is the idea that everything outside of Europe and the US and what we perceive to be the West is inherently bad, because any ideas or politics or beliefs that don't match with our Western worldviews, we see as negative rather than just seeing as different. Americentrism, also known as US centrism, fuels the idea of American exceptionalism. US centrism is essentially Eurocentrism, but just hyper focused to the United States. And we can go ahead and move to the next slide. So American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States is like inherently different from every other country. And like different probably isn't the right word. Better would be a more accurate wording. American exceptionalism is this idea that America is just inherently better than everybody else. That politics are better, the people are better, the environment is better. And for those of us living in America, we know like not really. But yeah, it's basically the idea that American values, politics, and history is so unique and so special that it deserves national recognition and admiration. That our politics are more powerful, more enlightening, more socially correct and appropriate than the politics of any other country. It is self-congratulatory in nature and really more ego boosting than anything else. It also diminishes the work done by other nations as lesser than. We can move to the next slide. So how does that apply to the LGBTQ community? Because this is a conversation about like national globalism and colonization and colonialism. And people don't really see how that ties into specifically talking about LGBTQ history. But US centrism does affect the way that we understand our history, because a lot of LGBTQ liberation efforts have happened outside of the US, and those efforts are not lesser than the work that's happened here. So a lot of times we can exist under the illusion that LGBTQ rights violations happen less in the United States than in other countries. And that isn't inherently accurate. LGBTQ true rights violations happen in large scale in the United States, sometimes at a much higher rate than other countries. We also exist under the impression that it's safer here than there, and that there is more LGBTQ resistance here than in other countries. In reality, LGBTQ resistance as well as acceptance has existed in a variety of Latinx countries for decades. We can move to the next slide. So Argentina, Uruguay, Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica have all legalized same-sex marriage. The president of Brazil is extremely homophobic. However, even with that, there was still a push to legalize same-sex marriage. And some of these countries also allow for the legal changing of one's gender on government documents, which some of our states don't allow. These countries and others have been sites of revolutionary LGBTQ works for decades, if not centuries. And we can move to the next slide. Okay. So why is it important to recognize the work that has been done outside of the US? LGBTQ history isn't exclusive to the United States. Our history is an international one, and our community has fought for liberation regardless of where our geographic location is. And our community doesn't just exist in the United States. So when we diminish the voices of those who fight in countries that may be even more homophobic and transphobic than the United States, we ignore some of the strongest and most courageous voices in our movement. We can move to the next slide. So who are we honoring today? We can move to the next slide. We'll be talking about Nancy Cardenas. She is an actor, a poet, and a writer. She worked as a playwright and successfully directed many plays in the theater company in Mexico. She is one of the first Mexican people in recorded history to publicly come out as queer in a television broadcast at age 39. In 1974, she founded the first gay rights organization in Mexico, El Frente de Liberación Homosexual. She was a very, very powerful figurehead. As I was researching about her, there was a story where there was a woman outside of a liberation conference she was going to that held up a sign basically calling for her death. And she went up and spoke to that woman and found out that she was being paid to be there by the police chief. So she was known and regarded to be a very kind and gentle person who was able to have kind conversations with everybody and really be able to advocate for herself in powerful ways. We can move on to the next slide. We'll also be talking about Emilio. He was born in 1893. He found that in the Mexican Revolution from 1913 to 1918, he became a colonel, and he also adopted male pronouns and began using he/him pronouns. He adopted male attire and began using he/him pronouns. You can move to the next slide. After a switch of pronouns, the military accepted this and granted him a veteran's pension. They also acknowledged his pronouns as he/him and acknowledged him as a man when they awarded him this veteran's pension, as well as a medal as honorary legionnaire of the Mexican Army. And this all happened in the 1970s. And we can move to the next slide. Tamara Adrian is a Venezuelan politician who ran in 2015. She's also a trans woman and the first transgender politician to be elected into office in Venezuela. She is a member of the Popular Will Party, and this party is in opposition of the current Prime Minister Nicolas Maduro, who has arrested over 13,000 protesters. We can move to the next slide. During her election, she promised to promote proper public access to public records on identity, same-sex marriage, and human rights. What inspired her involvement in politics was the 2014 arrest of over 13,000 freedom fighters who protested against their government in Venezuela. Many of those people are still political prisoners living in jails. She is a retired professor, a lawyer, and she is still currently a member of the Venezuelan parliament. We can move to the next slide. Finally, we will be talking about Pedro Lemebel. He is a Chilean novelist from Chile. He is known for critiques of authoritarianism and of all kinds, regardless of what party it's coming from. And his depiction of Chilean pop culture from a queer perspective in the 80s. He was also known for holding queer artists existing in pop culture at the time, like queer celebrities in Chile, accountable for their ignorance surrounding the poverty that regular LGBTQ folks were facing on a day-to-day basis. We can move to the next slide. So he defined himself as against all establishments of all kind. So he spoke about being against military dictatorship, Marxist resistance, which was being done from a homophobic lens, and neoliberal movements. He also spoke out about queer celebrity culture, ignoring the plights of LGBTQ folks living in poverty. We're going to read one of his pieces that kind of talks about like all of this, his resistance to government, his frustrations with the systems that ignore the poverty that LGBTQ folks face. And he's an exceptional writer as well. So he wrote novels, essays, as well as poems. We can move to the next slide. So I put in some of his quotes. And after we read these, we're going to go through one of the poems that he wrote. So one of the quotes is, "Before the artist comes the homosexual." Another one of his famous quotes is, "Any minority that is in a struggle for their rights will be described as violent because it is part of the fight." Now we're going to read through one of his poems. I'm going to do like a content warning here because this poem does utilize the F slur, as he is a gay man speaking about his experience. If you are uncomfortable hearing homophobic slurs as they exist within art, please go ahead and turn off this live stream now. It'll take about maybe 7 minutes to go through this poem fully. But I did want to offer that content warning. There is swear words in this poem. There are slurs used in this poem as being reclaimed by the artist. All right. This poem is called Manifesto. In parentheses, I speak for my difference. I'm not Pasolini asking for explanations. I'm not Ginsberg expelled from Cuba. I'm not a fag disguised as poet. I don't need a disguise. Here is my face. I speak for my difference. I defend what I am, and I'm not so strange. Injustice stinks, and I suspect this democratic dance, but don't speak to me of the proletariat, because to be poor and queer is worse. One must be tough to withstand it. It is to avoid the machitos on the street corner. It is a father that hates you because his son is a queen. It is to have a mother whose hands are slashed by bleached, aged from cleaning, cradling you as if you were ill because of bad habits, because of bad luck, like the dictatorship, worse than the dictatorship because the dictatorship ends and democracy comes, and right behind it, socialism. And then what? What will you do to us, compañero? Will you tie us into bales by our braid, destined to arrive in some AIDS-ridden quarter of Cuba? Put us on some trains to nowhere, like General Ibanez's ship, where we learned to swim, although no one reached the shore. This is why Bapriaso turned off its red lamps. This is why the whorehouses offered a black teardrop to the queens that had been eaten by lobsters. In that year that the Human Rights Commission doesn't remember. That's why, compañero, I ask you, does the Siberian train of reactionary propaganda still exist? That train that passes across your eye when my voice becomes too sweet, and you, what will you do with those memories of us as children wanking each other, amongst other things, on holiday in Cartagena? Will my future be black and white, day and night without ambiguity? Won't there be a fag on some street corner establishing the future of your new man, your new man? Will you let us embroider birds onto the flags of the free fatherland? I will leave the rifle for you, the cold-blooded one. And it's not that I'm afraid. The fear wore away, used to blocking knives in the sexual underground where I used to be. And don't feel offended if I speak to you of these things. And look at your package. I am not a hypocrite. Don't a woman's tits make you lower your eyes? Don't you think that all alone up in the ranges we might have gotten up to something? Although you would hate me later for corrupting your revolutionary morality, are you afraid of life becoming homosexual? And I'm not talking about putting it in and taking it out and only taking it out and putting it back in. I'm talking about tenderness, compañero. You don't know how hard it is to find love under these conditions. You don't know what it is to deal with this leprosy. People keep their distance. People understand and say he's a fag, but he writes well. He's a fag, but a good friend. Really cool. I'm not cool. I accept the world without asking for coolness, but they laugh anyway. I have scars on my back from being laughed at. You think that I think with my ass, and that with the first electroshock from the CNI, I was going to spill it out. Don't you know that my manhood wasn't learned in the barracks? My manhood was taught to me by the night behind a street post. That manhood that you boast about was stuffed into you at the regiment of a military killer, like those that are still in power. My manhood wasn't given to me by the party because they rejected me with laughter many times. I learned my manhood by participating in the toughness of those times, and they laughed at my fat voice yelling, and it will fall, and it will fall. And although you yell like a man, you haven't been able to make him leave. My manhood was the gag. It wasn't going to the stadium and starting a fight for Colo Colo. Football is another hidden homosexuality, like boxing, politics, and wine. My manhood was to bear the mockery, eating rage in order to not kill myself. My manhood is to accept myself as different. To be a coward is much harder. I don't turn the other cheek. Instead, I present my ass, compañero, and that is my vengeance. My manhood waits patiently for the machos to get old because at this stage of the game, the left sells its flaccid ass to in the parliament. My manhood was different. That's why I'm not getting onto this train without knowing where it will go. I will not change for Marxism that rejected me so many times. I don't need to change. I am more subversive than you. I will not change because of the rich and the poor. Try that on someone else. Nor will I change because capitalism is unjust. In New York, fags kiss on the street, but I'll leave that to you. Who is so interested? The revolution must not rot entirely. I'm giving this message to you, and it's not because of me. I am old, and your utopia is for future generations. There are so many children that will be born with a broken wing, and I want them to fly, compañero, and that your revolution gives them a red piece of the heaven, so that they can fly. Um, what do these stories tell us? I think similarly to what we talked about in the presentation yesterday and the night before, these stories let us know that this fight is still happening. Um, and that there's really strong value in the words of our ancestors and the folks who came before us, because a lot of the things spoken about in manifesto are relevant today. Of feeling like LGBTQ liberation is ignored by our government as a whole. It's a really, really powerful piece of work. And everybody's story is really powerful inherently. The fact that in Venezuela, there's someone who's elected to parliament to represent the voices of folks that are trans in Venezuela. These are really powerful instances. And if you want, you can also post in the comments saying what these stories tell you. We'll take maybe 30 seconds to allow some other comments to come in. And if not, we'll go ahead and move forward. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you so much for joining us for these presentations. We appreciated you being present for these three presentations that have happened over the last 3 days. Remember that there's still the virtual parade, the virtual festival, as well as the Pride site still happening. So please participate in those events as well. It was really great speaking to y'all, communicating with y'all through the comments, and going through the history in all three of these presentations. And it was really an honor to do this work. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. I'm really appreciative of it. Thank you, and have a great rest of your night.